Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into the world of Latin jazz today.
Ooh, one of my favorites.
I know, right? And we've got some great excerpts from this academic text about the history and evolution of the genre.
It's a really fascinating history.
Yeah, it turns out what we know as Latin jazz today has actually been around for way longer than most people think.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Latin and Caribbean rhythms have always been a part of jazz music, even before it had a name.
It's like this secret ingredient that's been there all along.
Absolutely.
Speaking of names, I was really surprised by all the different names that were used before it became Latin jazz.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, jazz criollo, rumba, jazz afro-cubano, cubop, even mambo.
Wow. That's quite the list.
Yeah, right? It's like a whole musical identity parade.
It really shows how this music has evolved and changed over time.
For sure. And at the heart of it all, of course, is rhythm.
The heartbeat of it all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of rhythm, the text mentions these terms, cinquillo and clave.
Yeah, those are important.
And I'll admit, I was a bit lost at first.
Well, think of cinquillo as like a rhythmic building block. It's a 5-beat pattern, and it's found all over the world, from Spanish flamenco to even some pop music today.
Wow, so it's not just some obscure musical term, it's like everywhere.
It's everywhere. It really gives Latin music that distinct energy.
It's the energy that makes you want to move, right?
Jack, what about clave?
Clave is the heartbeat of Cuban music specifically. It's a rhythmic pattern that creates that feeling of anticipation and release, like a wave that keeps pulling you back in.
Okay, so we have this clave driving Cuban music. But how did that rhythm make its way to American jazz and create the Latin jazz we know today?
Well, picture New Orleans. Back in the late 1800s, musicians would travel down to Cuba and soak up the sounds of the habanera, a very popular Cuban dance.
So they're down in Cuba, soaking up the sound.
Exactly. And they'd bring those rhythms back to New Orleans with them, ready to blend those rhythms into their own music.
It's like a musical souvenir.
And that's a great way to put it. It all makes sense now when you think about how Jelly Roll Morton, one of the pioneers of jazz, talked about a Spanish tinge in the music.
He could sense this fusion was coming.
Exactly. And then boom, the 1940s hits, and that's when Latin jazz takes center stage.
It explodes onto the scene.
In New York, Mario Bauza is composing Tanga, a piece that's considered a turning point for the genre.
A groundbreaking moment for sure.
And at the same time, over in Havana, jazz musicians are jamming, adding their own twist to those Cuban rhythms.
A musical conversation across the ocean.
Right. And then comes the legendary Nizzy Gillespie.
Ah, yes.
He teams up with the amazing Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo.
An iconic duo.
Together, they create Manteca, which has become the anthem of Latin jazz.
It really captures the energy and improvisation of this new sound.
Manteca is such a classic. You can't help but move when you hear it. That blend of jazz harmony and driving Latin rhythms is just irresistible.
It's infectious.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? What about Arturo Chico O'Farrell and cubop? How does that fit into all of this?
Well, O'Farrell is really interesting because he took bebop, that complex jazz style.
Yeah, bebop can be pretty out there.
Exactly. And he infused it with these traditional Cuban rhythms, and he called it cubop.
It's like he was blending the old and the new.
Exactly. And
Oh.
it really blew people's minds.
I bet. So he showed that Latin jazz could be traditional and avant-garde at the same time.
Absolutely. And don't forget the importance of the percussion in Latin jazz.
Yeah, percussion is so key.
It's the rhythmic foundation, the driving force. The text even quotes Eddie Palmieri.
Oh yeah, the salsa legend?
Yeah, he said, a true Latin jazz ensemble needs a full Afro-Cuban percussion section.
I can totally see why. It gives it that raw energy.
It's all about authenticity, staying true to those traditional rhythms while still pushing the boundaries. But, you know, it wasn't just Cuban influences that shaped Latin jazz.
Right, right. What about bossa nova?
Bossa Nova, a whole other world.
It's got that cool, laid-back vibe.
Oh.
So different from the fiery energy of Cuban Latin jazz.
Yeah, it brings in Brazilian samba rhythms and even a touch of French Impressionism.
Wow, so many different influences coming together.
That's the beauty of Latin jazz. It's a fusion of so many different styles and rhythms. And those Latin rhythms started to make their way into other genres too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like what?
Ooh, like tropical jazz that came out of Mexico.
Okay. Yeah.
And even rock and R&B musicians started incorporating Latin percussion into their music.
It's like those rhythms were just too good to be contained to one genre.
They just had to spread out,
Correct.
crossing borders and genres, becoming a part of this global musical language.
And they're still evolving today, right?
Absolutely. The text really emphasizes how Latin jazz is constantly evolving, taking inspiration from all over Latin America and the Caribbean.
Wow, so we're talking Dominican, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, Colombian, Peruvian rhythms.
All finding their way into the mix. It's like a giant musical tapestry woven from all these different cultures.
It's amazing how music can connect us like that.
It's a powerful thing. And this musical evolution, it's really intertwined with the larger story of cultural exchange between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the rest of the world.
So when we listen to Latin jazz, we're not just hearing music, we're experiencing history and culture.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important point that the text makes: the importance of rhythm as a reflection of culture itself.
Okay, that sounds deep.
Hmm.
How does rhythm reflect culture?
Well, the text talks about how culture is defined by how we use time and space. Every culture has its own way of moving, of experiencing time.
Right, different cultures have different rhythms of life.
Exactly. And rhythm, with its patterns and pulses, it's a direct expression of that.
I see. So when we listen to Latin jazz, we're not just hearing music, we're getting a glimpse into a culture's way of being.
Exactly. We're feeling its energy, its spirit come alive through the music.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate the depth and complexity of the music.
Definitely. And it's exciting to think about how that cultural conversation through music is still happening today.
Latin jazz is always evolving.
It's never standing still, always looking for new inspiration and pushing boundaries.
So much creativity.
Really?
Well, let's take a step back and think about what we've learned from this deep dive today.
Sounds good.
We started by uncovering this hidden history of Latin jazz. You know how those Latin and Caribbean rhythms were influencing jazz even before it had an official name?
Like a secret ingredient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we talked about rhythm and those terms like cinquillo and clave.
Those key rhythmic elements.
They really shaped the feel and the energy of the music.
The driving forces.
And of course, we can't forget the pioneers like Dizzy Gillespie, Chano Pozo, Mario Balza, Arturo Chico Farrell.
The legends.
Each one adding their own voice to the mix.
Shaping the sound of Latin jazz.
And we saw how Latin jazz expanded, bringing influences from Brazil with bossa nova.
Right, and spreading those rhythms to other genres like rock and R&B.
It's a story of cultural exchange, innovation, and so much creativity.
It really is.
It makes you wonder what's next for Latin jazz. What new fusions and rhythms are waiting to be discovered?
That's the beauty of it. We never know what's around the corner.
Always something new to explore.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Latin jazz.
It's been a pleasure.
Keep those ears open and let the rhythms move you.
Until next time.